Today I'm joining the Melbourne-based artist and sound designer Peter Miller, who teaches sound at Swinburne University and whose projects have ranged from set design on pop videos for Crowded House in the 1980s, through sound installations for Qantas, to work on the Oscar-winning 2011 animation Rango. Peter, thanks for making time to speak with us today.
Oh, it's entirely my pleasure.
Thank you. We're here to talk primarily about your work, which overlaps with libraries and archives, and particularly the use of digitised images from their collections.
Sure.
I'm interested in your project Ravens, which used images from the State Library of Victoria. I wonder if you could describe that for us and tell us how it came to be.
Yeah, Ravens is it started out as a sound piece because I'm a composer and a sound designer. So I'd taken a bunch of recordings from an online resource called LibriVox. LibriVox is a public domain site where people read from works that are in the public domain, from literature and other published works. They're in the public domain, which means that their copyright is no longer relevant. And when you make a reading for LibriVox, you also agree to make your voice readings public domain as well. Which means, of course, that they can be used for anything at all. And for me, that was a very interesting idea, to be able to use them as a resource for creating a sound work, which is what Ravens was. It's not the first time I've done that. I've actually used some LibriVox things for other works as well. But what I'd become interested in was, because I spent a lot of time in LibriVox listening to the readings and so forth, I realised that in some cases, in particularly popular works, you can have more than one reading. So maybe, as in the case of the source material for Ravens, which was Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven, I think I counted there were actually 23 readings of The Raven. So, of course, this is really interesting for me because it means I can listen to a whole lot of different interpretations of that work. And then and what I did was I picked particular words and phrases, and I used different readings of those words and phrases to kind of build up this sort of abstract version of The Raven. Once I had that recording, my idea was to then somehow realise that in a visual sense. And what I did was, at that time I'd been very, very interested in the resource that the State Library of Victoria had made available, which was a digitising of photographs that were in their collection, many of which kind of were as early as sort of like the mid to late 1800s, glass plate negatives of various people. And I thought I would take some of these photographs and use them as a sort of a way of expressing the words that were spoken by the readers. So the Ravens takes the form of a long single track through a room where we see portraits hanging on a wallpapered wall, and we just continually go past these portraits, and the portraits themselves then speak the words of the piece. So that's what Ravens is. Yeah.
Marvellous, and hopefully we'll be able to put a little excerpt in here at this point. Tell me, how long did it take, and how do you get started with a project like that? You have the soundtrack, you have these voices creating this kind of polyphonic recital, and then you start to find portraits that are of interest to you. How do you begin creating a piece like that?
I have to think back as to how I actually went about it. The thing for me was that there was something very strikingly poetic about the way the voices all work together. And I guess, I was thinking about, well, how do you do that? I mean, the first kinds of ideas that came into my mind were people standing up on a stage in an auditorium doing a recital, like different people doing different things. And I was thinking, that could be really interesting. But ultimately, it was really the images themselves from the library. So I was in that resource, looking through the digital image pool, and I just got really fascinated with these old photographs, and then I started to realise, of course, the time almost intersects. So that was the next step. Well, how can I use these images to do what I want them to do? And I discovered, there's heaps of great software out there. I discovered a way of animating the portraits in such a way that they actually do speak, and that kind of built on itself, and it became the idea of the track through the long corridor came very early on. And technically, because my animation skills are they're sort of fairly scattered, and I couldn't figure out a way of doing that. So it took me a long time to figure out, well, this is the way I can actually make this work. Once I'd done that, then it was a matter of teeing up all the portraits and everything and working out all the motion for the portraits and so forth. But I guess it was the images themselves that it was just one of those great confluences, where I was working with the sound, I was trying to think of an idea for the image side of it, and at the same time I discovered the image pool, and I thought, oh, okay, bang, it all clicked together like that.
Did you have a kind of long list of portraits? Did you do a deep delve and have
Oh yeah, I had hundreds of portraits. I literally spent I think probably the better part of 2 weeks in the image pool, just looking at stuff. I mean, aside from anything else, it's incredibly fascinating. There's all this material in there. There's not just portraits. There's lots and lots of things. So I'm a very bad one for sidetracking. So I'll find a portrait and then I'll kind of look at all of the text that's involved with the portrait and go and look at other things as well. So I discovered all kinds of other things. Too many of the portraits that are in there come from collections of old photographic studios. And often there is information associated with the portrait which will talk about the studio that was used. And one of the particular studios that I came across is called the Temple of Light, which is really lovely. It's a place a portrait studio place in Adelaide in the late 19th century, where people would go and would have their portraits taken. It was a huge thing. So yeah, lots and lots of time in the image pool, just looking at these pictures, and they're all they're ultra high definition, so it's a wonderful resource.
And you were able to search them from the comfort of your own studio.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. A whole lot of. I don't think all of the material that the library has is actually in the image pool, but there's a lot of stuff there. I think there's many thousands of images. So.
And it sounds like, from what you're saying about the Temple of Light, that Adelaide studio, that even though you were essentially looking for anonymous faces to ventriloquize your Edgar Allan Poe project, you actually discovered something about the history of photography in Australia as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the process of those kinds of photographs. So we're talking about sort of from the mid 1800s to maybe into the early 1900s. The process of taking photographs at that time was, as many people will know, is they were taken on a glass, exposed on a glass plate. So many of these photographs are actual glass plates that are in the collection. Each of the images that is digitized comes with some text describing if they know who the sitter was, if they know where it was taken, and so forth. And as I said, not all portraits, so sometimes there's various other things. So there's a lot of extra information that you can actually find about this stuff. And also they have, the archivists have actually taken the trouble to do things like digitize the calling cards of some of these photographic studios. So you can actually see where they were. You can even look at the streets where they were. I went and looked for one of them and thought, I wonder what's there now. It's not a photographic studio.
Unfortunately. Anything exciting in its place?
No, I think it was a mall.
Okay. It's the great Australian way.
Yeah. Many kind of sidetracks. So, and of course, and another thing's really interesting as well, is they have digitized not just perfect plates, but also damaged plates. So you can actually see kind of things with a little bit of damage and cracks, and even some of them it might be a portrait, but you can't even tell there's a person. There's so much damage there, which I find fascinating also.
You incorporated some of these damaged plates into Ravens.
Yeah. In the second part of Ravens, where the first part of Ravens has a lot of candles alight, and then the candles get blown out by the wind. And once that happens, we go into another world where, if you look carefully, you'll see that the wallpaper on the wall has changed to something more sinister, and the portraits themselves have all become very decayed, and there are spider webs and things on them. So I used some of the decayed and destroyed portraits as well. Yeah.
Wonderful. So it's actually genuine decay. It's not artificial.
No, absolutely. It's on the glass plates. It's on the original glass plates. Yeah.
Marvelous. Yeah. So you spent 2 weeks rummaging around, finding the portraits, the long list, and then starting to cut them down to the ones that you thought would best fit the video.
Right.
Just tell us a little bit about this process of bringing a face to life and animating the features.
Okay. So I used an animation program which is more or less designed to animate cartoon characters, but what it allows you to do is it's a fairly standard animation process where you can move a mouth to make the various forms that we're accustomed to seeing when someone's speaking. So we have charts to do that in animation that gives you the p or b or sounds, the form of your mouth.
Right, the mouth shapes that go with each one.
Correct. So I take the recording of the little snippet that was concerned at that particular time, and I can then cause the mouth to move by allocating this is a B sound and this is an M sound or this is an O sound at the right place. So it's kind of like, it's a little finicky. You have to get in there and actually work out the actual shape of the mouth at the particular times. But it's a lot easier than it used to be in the old days because computers do a lot of the work for you. Right. But nevertheless, it means that you can actually distort the mouth in such a way that it will actually appear to be saying the words that that you have there. Yeah. And also the process that I used also allows you to kind of move the face a little and close the eyes, so you can put blinks in and things like that as well, so it makes it feel a little more realistic.
Yeah, you've added these marvellously sinister asides from some of the characters, like some of their looks and glances.
Yeah, there's a few little glances and oddnesses, yeah.
It sounds like it's a painstaking approach, but also quite procedural in some ways to get the face to match up to the sound.
Yeah, it's the animation program that I use does that. So it's really just about understanding how people speak and tooling it to best work for this process. It's not entirely designed for doing what I was doing, but it still works perfectly to do that.
Surely. Yeah. Did you find that you had a favourite portrait amongst those which appear in the video?
Oh, I have several actually. There's a very kind of suave, debonair-looking chap who's kind of sitting in an interesting pose, and I kind of like him. And there's a couple, which is an old woman and a man, and they're just such an odd-looking couple. And occasionally in Ravens, there'll be two voices or more speaking at the same time. So having a man's voice and a woman's voice speaking at the same time was perfect opportunity to have this couple say something, which was fantastic as well. Plus I also used there are a couple of marble busts in the process, and I had them speak as well. They didn't come from the State Library's collection, but they're also public domain images, which I've used. I work a lot with public domain stuff.
Yes, and it sounds like you actually had layers of material from different origins. So you have the State Library portraits, you generated some of the imagery yourself.
Right.
The marble bust came from the public domain, as did LibriVox. But then also the raven itself, which appears in the video, comes from another source again.
Yes, so it's a wonderful world of kind of public usage out there if you really know how to find it. And I found a chap who had done some green screen work with a raven from a place called Falconry, Scotland, on YouTube. And he put it up on YouTube, and it's basically a raven doing various things against a green screen. And he put it up, and I just wrote to him. I said, would you mind if I use this? And he just very kindly gave me permission to do it for no fee. And it suited me perfectly because in the poem of the Raven, the narrator talks about the bust of Pallas, which sits above the door, that the raven perches upon. Well, of course, it's very easy to find a bust of Pallas, which is in the public domain because it's a very famous sculpture. So, I was just able to take that and then arrange it in such a way that the green screen raven appears that it's perching on it. It's the amazing world of modern digital technology.
Yes, it seems to really, this project expresses there's a bit of collaboration, working with peers, drawing from historic collections, something that's deeply local to the city you live in, but also the literature of Poe and this connection to global literature as well.
Right, yeah.
Really nice.
I really like doing that sort of thing where you draw kind of parallels or draw from different places, pull them all together and give it a sort of a unity. I mean, one of the things that people don't really know a lot about Australia, and we don't have a great history of it here, but it was a very big thing, was that Australia was actually quite focal in the spiritualist movement around about that time, so in the late 19th century. And we had visits from people like Arthur Conan Doyle, who was into spiritualism. And so there was a kind of quite a big spiritualist movement, and there's an overlap in photography between the spiritualist movement and photography, because photography was a burgeoning new thing at that time, and so it seemed like a natural fit for spiritualism to kind of explore it, and so they did. And so people had spiritualist photos taken of them with their departed and so forth,
right,
which are essentially tricks.
Yes.
We don't have a great reflection of it in Australia. There is some, but it was much bigger in America.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting overlap, I think, that idea of these recorded images and the possibility of recording the afterlife on a camera, which is new technology, so it had some sort of a magical quality to it.
Yes, and that speaks very nicely to the subsequent project that you've been exploring in the follow-up to Ravens, having had this good experience with the State Library's collections.
Yeah.
I understood you took the name of the Temple of Light to this
Correct.
photography studio of Adelaide,
Yeah.
and came up with a physical installation which you've been experimenting with. Could you tell us some more about that?
Okay, so one of the things I find really interesting about the photography of that time, it's very different from the way, and we are so accustomed to seeing photographs now. I mean, we take photographs all the time. Everybody takes photographs every day. But once upon a time, and we're talking about that period from the mid 1850s right through to the end of the 19th century, photography was very, very special, and it was also it was kind of the next natural progression from portraiture. And if you know anything about classical portraiture, one of the things that features very strongly in classical portraits is people don't smile. It was always seen to be a very grave and serious occasion to have your portrait taken or painted. And that followed on into photography as well. So when people started having portrait photography taken, they didn't smile. And if you look back through the collection, if you find the earliest ones you can find and look right through into the early 1900s, you don't find people smiling. In fact, I think I could probably say that I don't think I found a single person with a smile on their face. So it's very formal. And you can kind of understand it because it was a very special thing. If you were going to have your photograph taken, you went to a studio, you had to stand very still because the exposures were very long for those glass plates. And they even had ways of propping people up so they wouldn't move too much.
Yes, I heard people were strapped in place sometimes.
Correct, yeah. They would actually kind of, put straps under the clothes so you couldn't actually move your body at all, because you might have to stand still for a minute or something, keep your head very still for a minute. And in fact, there's some interesting things in the archive where you see the odd occasional photograph of someone sitting with a child, and the child's moved because it's very hard to keep a kid still.
Of course.
And so you've got a blur, and that's a very interesting kind of little artifact of that period of time. But mostly adults, of course, they want a really good portrait, so they kind of stand very still. And also, again, it's pretty hard to keep a smile there for that long too. So another reason why you'll just keep a very composed sort of face, so it just helps you be very still while you have your portrait taken.
So Temple of Light, the installation itself, you were starting to prototype it, and it uses these glass plates with ultraviolet light and explosive luminosity.
Yeah, so I kind of wandered there, didn't I? So I'm interested in that process of exposure, of these exposures. So it's light going onto a plate, and then that plate becomes your negative, and then you can make a print off that. Or in some cases in those days, the glass plates themselves were the print. But what I became fascinated with was this idea of the exposure, or two things. One other thing that's very interesting about a lot of stuff that's in the archive is that the photographs are of people that we now no longer have any history of. So they come up as unknown sitter, anonymous person. So we don't know who they are, and there's no way of tracing who they are. So the process, I imagine, is that many of these things have come to the collection through the glass plates of a studio. So someone's inherited them, and they've finally donated them to the library, and the library's then digitised them. But if you've got a glass plate and there's nothing attached to it, you don't know who that person is. They're a completely anonymous, unknown person. And I became very interested in this idea that there are these kind of unknown people. We don't know who these people are. And it's kind of profound in a way, because they're the only trace of that person in our modern times is that photograph, is that glass plate.
Yeah, and it's an actual record of the light which fell on them at that time.
Which fell on them at that time. So I kind of had an idea of trying to replicate that experience in a kind of a slightly sped up way. So I made some glass plates, I coated them with luminous paint, and then the idea is that there is a light, an ultraviolet light, because it's very good for exposing those plates, comes on very briefly with a negative of the actual image that's exposed onto a luminous plate. And then, so a viewer would see this exposure, and then the exposure would slowly fade away, just as the memories of these people have slowly faded away. Trying to get that idea that, you know, these are people who did exist, and trying to relate to these people, but understand that we know nothing about them at all. The image is the only thing we have of them.
I also have had this experience working in the archives. There comes a point where you have to have faith that people genuinely existed in the past, and trust that a document you have in front of you, a real hand wrote this message from 1870 or 1930, whatever it is.
And it's, isn't it? It's so important to understand that, and sometimes we don't. I mean, you see these kind of transcriptions of things, and you forget that a person did that. You know, someone sat in front of that piece of paper and wrote those things. So you're seeing traces of that person, you know, you're feeling traces of that person.
And you found, as you developed Temple of Light, you also came up with a way for audiences or spectators or participants in the exhibition to kind of speak back to those images as well.
My idea was, so this also comes from spiritualism, which again was a big thing at that time. One of the things that happened in the spiritualist movement is that if you went to sit with a medium and you were talking to your dear departed, sometimes the messages would come from the dear departed in the form of writing on slates. And so, you know, your long lost mother or your son who died in the war or whatever might communicate to you just a few words on a slate. So I had an idea of trying to kind of almost reverse that process so that people could communicate back with the spirits. And the way that would happen would be that I made these little luminous slates which you can write on with an ultraviolet pen. And the idea is that the audiences have the experience of seeing these people and then can write them a message. And in a similar way to the way that their images fade, the messages written on the slate will also fade away as the luminous effect wears off. So it's kind of trying to, once again, get you to understand this bridge between those people who no longer exist except in the form of this kind of version of light, and the light that you're writing with, communicating back with them.
Yes, lovely. Communication via light is brilliant.
Yeah.
And tell me, you also had this feeling as well of, it almost speaks to challenges we have today around privacy and intrusion on people's lives, the sense that you were kind of peering in on these lives without their permission in some ways.
Absolutely. So one of the things, you know, we're keenly aware of the fact these days of you know, owning our privacy, you know, this idea that you give people permission to do things. And even with images and things, you know, there's all this stuff with Facebook about, you know, they uploaded images to some site, and that site now has all your images, and you're tricked into doing that kind of stuff. So you feel personally offended that someone took my likeness and did something with it, or might do something with it, you know. Whereas these people had really no concept of this at that time. I mean, you know, they were making a portrait for themselves or for loved ones or something, and probably the expectation was that they would do the sitting, they would get a portrait, and they would put that in their house. But that was it. And that image would go nowhere else. There was nowhere else for it to go. I mean, you couldn't, I guess you could make copies and send it to someone, but that was rarely done. It was more or less to do with making a portrait of yourself for your own viewing or your family's viewing. So the concept of kind of looking back through all of these images of people who had gone through this process, it started to feel to me quite intrusive in some ways, because, you know, I'm looking at people who never expected that this kind of thing would happen to them, and that their images would be used to do something else. In fact, I keenly felt it when I was doing Ravens, because I was actually making them say things that they may never have said. So it was quite interesting in that respect. But in Temple of Light, you know, the concept would be to be vastly more respectful to these unknown people, and try and get people to understand that concept, that they are actually real people that did exist at one time.
Absolutely. And I understand that while Ravens is available even now through YouTube and can be watched on screens everywhere, in the ideal world, Temple of Light would serve as an installation, so it would be in a physical setting.
Right.
That might even be the State Library. And you spoke before we started recording, but you mentioned that you came to see the library as a character in its own right. It's obviously a very iconic building in the heart of the city. It has a long history. Tell me about your coming to build a relationship with the State Library itself.
Well, like a lot of Melburnians, we have fondness for it because it is such a beautiful building, and it's in the very focal centre of Melbourne. So many people have seen it. Many people have been in there. The middle room with the dome is just an extraordinary place. It has an extraordinary feeling to it. It's still pretty much preserved the way that it was. It's very actively used because there's tours. I've been on tours through there several times, so I feel it's quite a special environment. And I have this, for me, libraries are interesting places because they're not only kind of this portal to the past or portal to finding research, but they have this kind of transitional effect. I mean, it's almost like a temple. I mean, you go there to do a thing, and that thing can oftentimes have some kind of sort of reverence to it, and I feel that very much in that central room in that library. But I also feel that there is this sort of transitional thing that happens with people too. We are sort of like ghosts passing through the library ourselves. We go there, we do things, and we go away. And a few times I've stood up on the higher balconies and I've looked down and just watched the path of people moving through this space and thinking they're kind of ghost paths that go through here, and the environment itself, is just so rich in history and feeling people photograph it all the time, and it's I don't know, it's very moving.
Well, indeed, the way it is formed from a number of buildings kind of thrown together, and sometimes you find an external wall inside the State Library. It's almost reminiscent of a work like Ravens, the way it's composited from layers.
There's a lot from pieces. That's right, little pieces in collections and things, and going through the halls with the exhibitions and stuff like that, which change all the time. So you're getting this kind of movement through there, and I think any time you go there, there's something of interest to pull out of one of those rooms. It's a place you can spend time for sure.
I like the way that a kind of sort of almost mystic or quasi-spiritualist approach also overlaps with something deeply practical. When you imagine those ghost trails watching people walk across the library floor, of course we live in this age of user experience and mapping user journeys and this idea of desire lines, people going where they want to, not where they're told. It seems that there's an opportunity there for an artist to kind of speak to the language of design in 2019.
Yeah, look, I think that the buildings or institutions, but buildings in particular, like the library, have more to say to the outside world than just we are a collection of archives that we can, or a collection of works or whatever that you can come and read. But I think that there's something more to it than that. It's a cultural institution that can be realised in different kinds of ways. And so for instance, the ghost path thing is something I think that's a really great opportunity for an artist to explore that kind of concept. One of the things that I've spoken to you in the past about is how these days with sound we have the ability to map environments with sound now. We can actually create the acoustics of any environment separate to the environment. So for instance, we could map the inside of the library and have a voice sound like that's where it was, any voice, anywhere. We do that all the time. I mean, I have maps now of the Sydney Opera House. I have maps of underground cave systems. I did some maps in the Jenolan cave system. So I can make a voice sound like it's actually in one of the caves in Jenolan. Just by applying the acoustics of that space to it. So it's actually an acoustic map of the internal space. So it's another ghostly thing in a way, because that's an impression that it doesn't exist as anything. It's really just the evocation of a space in acoustic terms. So again, a very ephemeral non-touchable thing.
Absolutely. And in fact, you've done some place-based works before. So, for example, in First Class Lounge for Qantas
Correct.
At Sydney Airport, I believe.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Yeah.
What does it mean to put a sound installation in a space? You know, hypothetically, for example, a library. How do you go about creating a work that suits a space?
Well, I mean, there are many ways you could do it. Do something, in the library. I wouldn't suggest that you'd want to actually put sound into that space, except perhaps in certain performance cases, maybe, because obviously it's a library and people really need to concentrate and do their work. But you may, for instance, be able to do things like, just off the top of my head, and I really haven't thought about this, but let's just say we went into the audio archives and we found a recording of Parks speaking, let's just say that. Mm-hmm. We could actually take that and we could put that in the environment of that central room. So his acoustics would become melded with that room in a way. Or we had a singer, for instance, we could put that environment that way. People could listen to it online. You could just listen to it as an audio recording. So there's a number of ways that you could do that kind of thing. You could obviously use it as a performance space as well. There's ways of doing that kind of thing. Yeah. So there's many possibilities with that kind of stuff, I think.
And you mentioned there the possibility of people listening to things online or being present in a room for a performance. Obviously with sound there's always that tension between the kind of immediacy of a live performance versus the complete control that one can have over a recording.
Right.
What's your take on that in terms of putting things out in a very controlled way, or working in sort of live spaces where we may not have complete control of all the variables?
I mean, both of those things are kind of have their own attractive possibilities. I'll give you an example that, the Qantas thing was very interesting because, so in the First Class Lounge at Qantas, this is the First Class Lounge in Sydney, the piece actually does play in some parts of the First Class Lounge in Melbourne as well, but it was designed for Sydney. And the approach to the First Class Lounge is quite interesting because you come in off the concourse, it's very noisy, and then you walk through some doors and you're in a very long corridor, one side of which has a hanging garden, a sculptural garden, and the other side is windows right out onto the tarmac. So you walk along this thing and then you go up escalators into the First Class Lounge. And so my work is designed for that long corridor with the garden on one side and the planes on the other side. And it was made from all Australian bird and insect sounds. And it's a musical work, but it's a cyclical work. It's in 6 cycles and it's meant to kind of play and interact over a period of time. So the whole work runs for about 6 hours if you were to listen to it end to end. And the idea was that, it's this kind of break from the bustle of the concourse, and you suddenly come to this area where you can see where your journey's going to go because you're looking at the plains, but you've also got this garden, so there's this intersection of the two worlds, and you have this kind of evolving and ever-changing abstract sound piece as well. But it has huge amounts of challenges working in a place like that. So, of course, much of these ideas kind of hark back to Brian Eno, who did this kind of work, this territory a long time ago. But it's very difficult to actually make a work that's both apparent and works and does something, and non-intrusive. And you're fighting that in public spaces when you make works, because you don't want something that's just going to be annoying to people, and yet you also want something that will have some form of effect. And we naturally gravitate to kind of naturalistic sorts of things with that, because we're accustomed to being in environments where we can hear birds, or we're accustomed to being in environments where there's rain or wind or so forth. So those kinds of things are good maps for that kind of thing. You certainly don't. So the other thing too is that you're actually satisfying a need for transitional passengers in that particular case, but there are staff who work there. So it can't be so intrusive that the staff just get really annoyed with it. Right. So there's a lot of constraints on working in those kinds of environments, but it's challenging, but it's its own kind of challenge. Of course, when you go into recording, you have complete control, so you can do anything you like, but then you lose that kind of like spontaneity of the live space, which is is always powerful.
Sure, and I'm sure challenge and constraint also affect an artist's creativity as well, knowing you have to deal with that specific journey, that specific architecture.
Yeah. I actually have very, high level of interest in sound works that are so. We are accustomed to sound works that are very, very linear. So when you hear a piece of music, you sit down and you listen to it from the beginning all the way through to the end. And it's a very linear work. There's really very little kind of sideways exploration in conventional music. But I've actually designed a few different kinds of works, one of which was designed to be played in a cave. And it's a various nodes of sound, and you actually transition through the sound. So there's an actual temporal change as you go through. So it's not the same piece every time you hear it, and you have to walk. Right. So you're not just sitting and listening and having it presented to you as a performance. You're actually moving through the performance. I really am interested in those ideas of blowing apart music or sound into different kinds of dimensions to see how we are affected by that.
And of course, that's also a very archival approach as well. So now in the digital age, we can range through history, but moving diagonally, looking at moments which coexist and artworks from time.
Right.
But even when they were on physical shelves, it's possible to treat time not just as a straight line when you're in the archive.
Correct. Well, that's one of the great things about, I said before, I go off on these tangents and things, but the tangents themselves are, for my personal creative process, are really valuable because, I find out all kinds of things about the world. And so my through line might be, look, I want to look at all these portraits because I have this idea of using them in such a way. But the journey never really happens like that. It goes portrait 1, portrait 2. Ew, that's interesting. I didn't know there was a station at Prince's Bridge before Flinders Street Station. Oh, that's a nice picture of that. And come back to portrait 3 and, meandering through the archive in that way is like the best kind of history lesson, really, because it's self-guided and you're learning the things that interest you about history, and you'll find out all these other things along the way.
It sounds like serendipity remains a sort of defining value for this kind of journey.
I think I could easily say serendipity is like a focal part of the work that I do. Yeah, I think it's an important part of pretty much everything I've ever done.
Yeah. And you've obviously had this very interesting journey we alluded to in your introduction, that you've really done a little bit of everything, working in the movies and in Hollywood, working on pop videos, sometimes working in sound, sometimes working on set design and production. You've turned yourself to so many aspects of media production and multimedia art. How do you think that helps you coming to this kind of project and engaging with the 21st century archive?
Well, look, I've said this to you on a few occasions in the past, but for me, having grown up with, I came into the film business when we shot on, physical media. We recorded our sound on physical media on tape, so it was way before the digital world, and it was not easy. You had to have lots of gear, and you had to have a fair amount of knowledge, and you had to have laboratories, and there were all kinds of other things that came into play. So now we're in this age of miracles, because I can literally do anything I could do back then I can do here in this room. I can make an entire movie in this room almost, if I really wanted to. But we know we can shoot high definition stuff on a telephone. Just not on a telephone. What am I saying? On an iPhone, you know that you can record stuff on little digital recorders. All of this stuff is very, very approachable. It's not expensive anymore, and you can then assemble the whole stuff in the highest resolution available on your computer, on a laptop or a desktop computer. It's an age of miracles. So for me, that span of mechanical stuff, that span of my first work in doing special effects was all very physical. We built models and miniatures, and learning how film works, learning how optics work, learning how to fool people, because that's pretty much what people in making movies do, learning how best to amalgamate that stuff to tell the story that you want to tell. Just learning all those different kinds of skills coalesces in this kind of area now for me, where I'm just really interested in finding material where I can find it, that I can expose to people in ways to make them revisit in interesting and novel and hopefully emotional ways, so that they can see and hear these things in ways that maybe they didn't think about them before, and have a new experience. Yeah. Because look, I wonder. I look at those photographs. I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but I go through those photographs, those portraits, and I literally as I said to you, I can sit for hours and just look at these things, and I look at the people, and I look at the things become apparent to you. Like a particular studio will have particular props and particular setups, and so the characters all form the same pose, and they all lean on the same plinth, and there's always the same curtain behind them. And this becomes this thing, and you start thinking, well, that was a thing.
Yeah.
That studio, that's what they did. That was their thing. And so that's a little piece of kind of who would bother to write down that kind of history? But nevertheless, that's important, isn't it? It's important to understand that there was a method that those people had. This is a method that nobody bothered to document in any formal way, that they weren't even thinking about, because really it's all about the person. Nevertheless, if you look at these images and you see maybe a dozen of these images in a row, and you go, wow, there's that plinth again. It's there again. And it's history. It's history of a particular kind that's not.
And we so often think of history as something which is textual or verbal, that's about a language, like an account, which is given of a time and a narrative. But actually, it's sometimes more like being a detective. It sounds like you sit at the junction of kind of artist, historian, and detective when you do this kind of work.
I love it. I dream of that moment where in the kind of ephemera of all of this stuff, that I suddenly find something that no one's ever thought about before. And I kind of go, wow, isn't that peculiar? And then suddenly everyone all over the world sort of goes, my goodness, we didn't even think of that, So it's like there's that great Egyptian historian whose name I cannot remember. Anyway, he started getting very interested in looking at the trash piles of these ancient cultures, because he figured that, quite rightly, all the stuff we know about many of the big ancient cultures, the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians and these people, this is all the work of rich people. We're seeing how the rich people did things. And he thought, no, I'm not interested in that. I want to know what the poor people did. And so he went through the trash. And so in those days, trash was kind of a bit more resilient. So there was clay tablets and things like this. You start finding out details of accounting. How the granaries were run, all this kind of stuff. This is so much more fascinating than, just some pompous king, because this is how people like us lived.
Yeah.
And I love that concept, I like that idea. So I want to know about those photographers who were, they were just doing a job. So, there was some props boy who was running around putting that plinth there, at that time in the studio. He was the guy who had to get the curtain right, and all this kind of stuff. There was a whole thing going on there that nobody bothers to record in history, because, who would be interested in that?
And it's interesting to me because obviously your artworks are very technically interesting, and there's obviously a great deal of technique that goes into whether it's creating the kind of computer environment of ravens or to create a physical installation by Temple of Light, but actually a great deal of empathy for the past as well. And actually human stories come out of this enterprise essentially of constructing illusions, that you're in the business of constructing illusions. Right.
I think it's nothing without human stories. I mean, honestly, I think nothing means anything if you don't have a human story there. And I feel very, the period of that turn of the century, from the 19th into the 20th century, is very interesting for very many reasons. I mean, it's the rise of the Industrial Revolution. It's the rise of many of the technologies that we have today, like photography and movies and sound and electricity and all of that stuff. It was like a massive increase in technological mastery. But at the same time, there was a very big personal story that was unraveling. And that was that people were now coming into conflict. So we had the conflict of religion and science coming into loggerheads. And we're just, as we get into the early 20th century, we have these massive wars. And people are now starting to try and figure out, they're lost, because it's like, where are the dead? Are they in a place? Can we talk to them? All this kind of stuff. And so there's a very poignant thing about that. People who lost people in the various wars, the Boer War. They're wanting to. People who died young in the First World War. 17 and 18-year-olds. People losing their sons, and Arthur Conan Doyle lost his son, and wanting to somehow relate to those people. And of course, then the way you go is, well, is this almost magical technology. Let's try and communicate with them via this magical technology and see, surely that's got to be able to bring them back to us. And so that's very poignant, I think. I mean, this kind of desperation for, the people who we've lost, and trying to find that and get people to understand, trying to empathize. That's part of the Temple of Light thing. It's empathy with these people who have gone. Like, we will be gone one day, and those people are gone. And it's the idea of trying to kind of empathize with that idea. It's a very much a people story, I think. Yeah. And the technology is a framework. I mean, it's a fascinating framework to hang things on, but it's always the people,
Yeah. And where once the spiritualists used the technology of their time to reach out to spirits because of a loss caused by the very material reality of industrial war, I suppose now the 21st century library offers a different set of technologies where we can also in some sense speak with the dead, even if it's just by conjuring back their representations.
Right, even more so than we once used to. I mean, I just read about a project which I thought was fascinating. I won't be able to get all the details right, but I'll try and sketch it out. It's a crowdsourced project where people actually take on the deciphering of mariners' logs across the world. So what happens is you go on, you log in, and they'll give you some documents to read, and you basically type them out. And so several people will do it because it's all in handwriting, and I've had a look at it. Some of it's very hard to make out. But the idea here is that we'll find if we can get all these mariners' logs and we can get it all online, we can computer correlate stuff.
Right.
And we can start finding out things about the weather and the marine patterns and the life and the sea life and all this kind of stuff. So this is a crowdsourced history project, which is magnificent. But one of the things you find out very, very, very quickly when you start reading these things is the people.
Right.
Straight away, you've got it. There's a captain writing about this stuff, and each person has got their own idiosyncratic way of doing things and looking at things and describing things, and it becomes terribly fascinating. I could get easily addicted to that. Just doing that for the pure reason of just reading what these people have to say.
Yeah. On a purely pragmatic level, what could libraries and archives and that kind of institution do to make life easier for somebody doing the kind of work that you do?
Well, look, I think that the State Library's image pool is a fantastic resource for someone like me. First of all, there's several things that are great about it. It's searchable, which means that you can put in a search for something like a portrait or something like that, and you'll get portraits, and that's great because that makes it really easy. The second thing is that it's very high resolution. So these are not just kind of like little JPEGs of things. These are actually properly sourced big images. Now, for artists, that's really important because we may want to do things with them, and we don't want to be working with very inferior quality things. Usually, I mean, sometimes that's useful too, but you want the option basically. So that's really good. I'm sort of frustrated by the State Library's archive in as much as that I know they must have audio recordings, but it's actually really hard to get to the audio recordings. I would really like to know what's there. I suspect that there's a technological problem there because audio recording archiving is actually difficult and time-consuming and expensive, all that kind of stuff. But, audio recordings are, they'll stretch back quite a way, I mean, probably into the mid-19th century, I think, maybe not quite that long, but certainly there'll be early stuff of the early 20th century. There'll be audio recordings right through up until even things from the 1930s and 1940s are going to be really amazing. I think that stuff would be very valuable to have access to. And moving image stuff as well. Of course, we're getting much later with that stuff, but any of those things are really good. I mean, for any punters, like I'm not a professional historian, but just being able to go in. I told you the thing about Princess Bridge, the station that used to be there. So before Flint Street Station was there was a station on the other side, which was called Princess Bridge Station. It was an amazing looking building. It had these two minarets on the top of it. It was really fantastic. But they needed to move it for some reason, I can't remember now, but they held a competition to design Flinders Street, and then they knocked the other one down. And kind of like quite ironically, of course, now with the new metro, there's a new station there. It's really hilarious. But this was a magnificent looking building. You can see it. There's pictures of it.
Marvellous.
In the archive. So that for me was fascinating because I know that area so well, and just to think, wow, this magnificent building used to sit here, and it's all gone now. It's just disappeared. So I think those kinds of things are really illuminating history. It'd be great to be. I mean, there's a whole this thing about AR now. There's
Augmented reality.
Augmented reality. But imagine being able to kind of do that sort of thing where, historically, where you walked down Flinders Street and you could turn around with your VR goggles and you could see the old Princes Bridge station sitting there where it used to be, superimposed over whatever's there now. I mean, wouldn't that be fantastic? It would give you a real feeling of that trip back into the past and how things happen. And just interesting to know the things that happened. I mean, why did they move it? What was the reason behind it? The competition, what happened there? How many people kind of bid on that, and why did we settle on the one that's there, and all that kind of stuff? I think it's just fascinating.
Marvellous. The other question I was going to ask, obviously you bring quite a unique skill set, a great deal of experience and a great deal of technical proficiency to the work that you do. If someone's interested in getting started with this kind of work of dabbling in a collection, repurposing it, activating it, transforming it into something, do you have any advice for beginners who might just want to explore this kind of work?
Oh, look, I mean, I would say that the most important thing is try not to have preconceptions of what you could do. I mean, look, there's so many interesting things in the library. And it's really just about trying to figure out something that suits you for your own interests and find a path through that. One of the things that fascinates me really greatly, and I haven't even looked into it, so this is an idea for free for someone, is maps. Like one thing that's interesting about maps is that maps change through time. So there's this kind of potential to try and find a certain part of Melbourne, let's say, and then do a historical trip backwards through the maps to an earlier time. There's some level of exploration in that, and I think you could maybe do like a treasure hunt in time.
Yeah, like going down through geological layers.
Yeah, right. So track a thing, through time, find that thing. There are 5 items that exist in 1847. Find those things. Here's the map of today. And give some clues on the map of today, and then let people make that journey back, the treasure hunt back to find those things. Top of my head. I mean, so many great things you could do with those ideas. So it's not to limit yourself to don't have a preconception. I didn't have preconceptions when I started out with the image pool. I had Ravens was done at that time, but it was the things arriving in time together that made them come together. But I didn't have a preconception that was where I was going to go. I just knew that the image pool was really interesting, and that's only one aspect of the image pool. There's many other aspects of the image pool that are fantastic, So I think, I suspect the thing to do is not to be afraid of wasting time there, just to be there and enjoy the process of doing that. Find an interesting thing and follow that thing and see where it takes you.
The voyage of discovery.
I know. I mean, it seems kind of weird, but I'm a bit of a history junkie, so I like that kind of thing. But I don't think... I think there's always a way through. I mean, I reckon I can teach anyone to be interested in something in a library. It's just a matter of, finding the little niche that you like and then following the path of that niche.
Brilliant. Well, we've taken up a lot of your time, and I know you've got projects to be getting back to, but the last thing I wanted to think about is we've been talking a lot around this question of sort of haunting and the past in the present over the course of this conversation, and even the idea, it's strange how we repurpose things from the past. So the panopticon, the big dome in the State Library, is really a surveillance tool. It's to let the librarian keep an eye on the readers.
On those wacky readers stealing our books.
And now it's been transformed into this beautiful place of performance and celebration and community. At White Night, they project images on it, and they've really turned something as unsexy as the CCTV camera into this beautiful, artistic, creative experience. So we're sort of haunted by those choices from the past. How do you think our time will haunt the future, and how would you like to be remembered?
I read a really interesting quote only a few days ago where somebody said, when you die, there will come a time when the last person you know thinks their last thought about you, and you will be gone forever. And I thought, that's true. I mean, unless you are an incredibly famous person, and that's only a very small percentage of the human population. But all of those Egyptian workers who put up those pyramids, no one knows who they are. I mean, and they all live lives like we live, So how do I think the future will remember us? I mean, one thing that's going to happen, obviously, is that we're starting to assemble this incredible footprint of humankind on the internet. So, at one stage, there's going to come a time where that's going to be an investigatable resource. We've had discussions about privacy, and I wonder whether in the future, privacy will just cease to exist entirely, and nobody will care anymore because you can't do anything about it. At that point, everything's accessible by everybody, and there may be things to be done at that time. I mean, I don't know, I can imagine sometime in the future someone finding all of my works and then kind of reinventing them in some bizarre way, I don't know, in ways that I couldn't even imagine, I suppose. I mean, much like, I don't think anybody from the 19th century thought that those glass plate negative portraits of themselves were going to end up on a weirdly strange luminous magic screen. I mean, why would they think that? How could they think that? Yeah, it's really hard to know. I mean, for me, I just think, trying to illuminate aspects of what it's like to be human will be the core thing that will survive always, because that's what we'll be like. I mean, even when we transition into AI, robot, cybernauts, whatever happens, as Ray Kurzweil likes to think is going to happen, we'll still be fascinated about what it's like to be human,
Yeah. And that question of fascination has run through the entire conversation. Your fascination with the archive, your desire to repurpose Poe's words into something that was new and transformed in some way. And the notion that perhaps somewhere, some future being has even stumbled on this little recording, and perhaps we are being listened to long after the last person who remembered us is gone.
Yeah.
Perhaps some future archaeologist, anthropologist or historian is listening to us now. Whether that's the case, someone from the future or someone from the immediate present, where is the best place for people to find out more about you and your work online?
All of my exploits you can find on my website, scribbletronics.com. There's a whole lot of sort of diverse stuff there, so that's the best starting point. I have nothing of Temple of Light up at the moment, but I will probably at some stage do that. But nearly everything else I've done is there.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your time, Peter. Thanks for telling us of all your work with libraries and archives. And I hope people will go and explore all the amazing things that are on scribbletronics.com. Thanks for your time, and I wish you luck with your future endeavours.
Thank you.